I gave my son everything. Every sacrifice I made, every sleepless night, every dollar earned was for him. I thought that no matter what happened in life, we'd always have each other. But one day, that belief was shattered. It wasn't some big event or a fight that broke us. It was something far worse. It was the silence. The moment when my son, the one I had given everything to, turned his back on me without a second thought. I needed him. I was older, fragile, and in need of help, but instead of coming to my side, he walked away. He said he had his own life to live. My heart shattered. In that moment, I realized that the very person I trusted the most was the one who left me to face the world alone. And yet, I didn't beg. I didn't chase after him. I did something far stronger. I used that pain, that betrayal, to fuel my own survival. I became independent again, just like I had once been when I built everything from the ground up. And years later, when my son came back, this time not to offer help, but to ask for it, I was ready. He needed me. But this time, the tables had turned. The lesson I had learned the hard way, the lesson he needed to understand, would be taught on my terms. I refused to save him. I refused to be the same man who had always given in. This time, it was about him learning the real value of life, responsibility, and respect. Andrew's life had never been easy, but had been simple. He was a man who believed in hard work, sacrifice, and responsibility. He had grown up in a modest home, the son of a hardworking father who instilled in him the values of dedication and perseverance. Andrew learned early on that life wasn't handed to you. You had to fight for it. And so, from the moment he could walk, he worked. The small town where Andrew was born and raised was filled with the scent of freshly cut grass, the hum of sawmills, and the soft chatter of neighbors who lived lives entwined by shared history. It was a place where people knew each other's business, where you couldn't run from your past. But Andrew didn't mind that. In fact, he took comfort in it. He liked the sense of community, the feeling of being rooted in something larger than himself. He liked knowing that if he worked hard enough, he could make a difference, both in his life and in the lives of those he loved. His first job was at a local hardware store, where he worked after school and weekends. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. And it taught him something even more important. Honesty and integrity were worth more than any paycheck. Over time, he saved enough money to buy his first car, a beat-up old sedan that seemed like the greatest treasure he could have ever owned. But even then, Andrew wasn't content with just getting by. He had bigger dreams, dreams of providing more for his future. As he grew older, his dreams evolved into a larger goal, to provide a better life for his son, Mark. His son was the world to him. Andrew's marriage to Helen, though not perfect, had always been centered on that common goal, giving Mark everything they never had. They worked tirelessly, day in and day out, to ensure that Mark had opportunities Andrew and Helen couldn't even have imagined growing up. They made sacrifices in ways that Mark would never understand. The family lived in a modest house on the edge of town, a place that Andrew had fixed up with his own hands. He put hours into the small repairs, from the cracked windowsills to the worn-out flooring. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. And in Andrew's eyes, it was perfect. It was a home, a sanctuary from the struggles of the outside world. Inside, the walls were lined with memories, photographs of family vacations, Mark's school achievements, and birthday parties that seemed to fade as time passed. Andrew couldn't remember a time when he didn't work, but that was because he didn't mind. His sacrifices were all for Mark's future. His dream was simple, to make sure Mark never had to struggle the way he had. Andrew's love for Mark was a constant thread in his life. From the first time he held his son in his arms to the moments spent teaching him how to ride a bike or tying his shoes, Andrew saw these milestones as a promise. A promise that his son would grow up strong and capable, with everything Andrew never had. The late nights studying, the weekend chores, the early mornings at the job. Andrew did it all with one goal in mind, Mark. But as Mark grew older, something started to change. The spark of gratitude that Andrew had once seen in his son's eyes began to fade. At first, it was small things, Mark becoming more independent, spending less time at home, getting involved in his own world. It seemed natural, even healthy. Andrew expected it. But the distance between them started to widen, little by little, until it seemed like a chasm that couldn't be bridged. The truth was, Andrew had been too busy giving to notice when Mark's attitude began to shift. He missed the signs, the complaints about the old house, the new friends who seemed to have more money, the resentment about not being able to have the latest gadgets. Andrew had worked so hard to give Mark a better life, and in many ways, he succeeded. Mark was popular, smart, and talented. But somewhere along the way, Andrew realized he hadn't given his son what mattered most: time. He had been so caught up in making money, in providing material things, that he missed the emotional connection, the simple conversations at the dinner table, the quiet moments when they could just be father and son. By the time Mark left for college, Andrew had already started to feel the sting of that distance. Mark's calls became less frequent. Visits home were rushed, always with excuses about school, friends, and the new life he was building. At first, Andrew told himself it was just a phase. But deep down, he felt the weight of it. Mark was becoming a man, and Andrew wasn't sure where he fit into that picture anymore. Years passed, and the phone calls never came. Andrew didn't mind that Mark was busy with his own life. He just wanted to know that his son was okay, that he hadn't been forgotten. But when Andrew was finally forced to admit that he was growing older, his health began to decline. The aches in his back grew worse, and simple tasks became harder. He realized he needed help. The first time he reached out to Mark for support, he didn't know what to expect. Maybe a visit, maybe a phone call to check in. But instead, Mark's response was nothing short of devastating. He was too busy with his own life. Mark had his own responsibilities now, his own future to worry about. Andrew felt his heart sink, but he told himself it wasn't the end of the world. After all, he had lived his whole life depending on no one but himself. But this time was different. This wasn't about doing things on his own. It was about the abandonment. The simple, crushing realization that his son, the one he had given everything to, was now the one who had walked away. The phone calls stopped altogether. The visits were few and far between, and when they did happen, they were fleeting, filled with excuses. Andrew began to feel invisible. He had poured his entire life into raising his son, and now, in his greatest time of need, the very person he had sacrificed everything for had turned his back on him. But Andrew didn't crumble. He didn't beg. He didn't call again or wallow in despair. Instead, he did what he always did. He took control of his life, just as he had always done. He used the bitterness of betrayal as fuel for his own independence. With the wisdom that only years of life could give him, he decided that he would never again be dependent on anyone, not even his own son. He would build his future alone, just as he had built everything else. And so, he opened a small business. It wasn't much at first, just a modest venture, but it was enough. Slowly, over time, Andrew's business grew. He became successful again in ways that mattered to him. He didn't need anyone to rescue him. He didn't need his son to lift him up. He had learned the greatest lesson of all, that you could survive without depending on anyone but yourself. But when Mark came back, asking for help, Andrew knew the tables had turned. The lesson he had learned the hard way, the lesson Mark needed to understand, would be taught on Andrew's terms. It wasn't until Andrew's health began to fail that the true weight of the situation hit him. He had always been strong, mentally and physically, but now, with his body growing weaker and his joints aching with every movement, he felt something else creeping in: vulnerability. And for the first time in his life, vulnerability didn't feel like strength. It felt like a burden. In the beginning, Andrew tried to ignore the signs. He kept pushing through, working tirelessly in his small business, making sure his customers were happy, keeping the financials in check. But every day, the pain became harder to ignore. His hands trembled as he counted the bills. His back ached as he bent to tend to the equipment. He knew his time was running out, and he would need help. But asking for help wasn't something Andrew was used to. He had spent his life proving that he could do everything on his own. His son, Mark, had been raised with the same values: work hard, never ask for help, and never show weakness. For years, Andrew had prided himself on being able to stand on his own 2 feet. He had made sure that Mark had everything he could ever need: the best education, a safe home, and opportunities far beyond what Andrew had ever dreamed of. And yet, as he sat alone in his living room, with the winter chill creeping in through the cracks in the walls, he realized how utterly alone he had become. When he called Mark for the first time to ask for help, there was a sense of hesitance in his voice, something he had never allowed himself to show. "Mark, I need you," Andrew said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to maintain his composure. "I'm struggling with the business. I can't do it all by myself anymore. I need you to come home for a while." Mark didn't respond immediately. There was a long, deafening silence on the other end of the line. Andrew held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The anticipation of hearing his son's voice, the sound of reassurance, was overwhelming. But what came next was a cold shock. "Dad, I can't," Mark finally said, his voice distant, distracted. "I have my own life now. My work, my career. I can't just drop everything to come home. You're going to have to figure this out on your own." Andrew's stomach churned. The words stung more than he cared to admit. He thought Mark would come to his aid, just as Andrew had always been there for him. But instead, Mark, now a man in his own right, was dismissive. It was as if Andrew's request for help, the vulnerability he had shown, was nothing more than a nuisance. "I'm sorry, but I can't," Mark continued, his tone flat and final. "I have things going on here. I'm not the one who can help you." The phone call ended, and Andrew stood there, the weight of his son's words sinking in. He hadn't expected Mark to come rushing to his side, but this indifference, it felt like a dagger to the heart. For years, Andrew had given everything for his son, and now, in his time of need, Mark had nothing to offer but excuses. The silence that followed was unbearable. Andrew stared out the window, the distant hum of passing cars the only sound filling the void. How had it come to this? How had the son he had devoted his entire life to, his only child, become a stranger, so willing to turn his back on him? Days passed, and Andrew's physical condition continued to worsen. The pain in his back, his knees, and his hands became almost too much to bear. He couldn't lift heavy boxes anymore. The physical demands of his small business were becoming overwhelming. The pride he had once taken in doing it all by himself began to feel like a burden. The isolation in his home, which he had once cherished as his sanctuary, now felt suffocating. He couldn't help but replay Mark's words over and over in his mind. "You're going to have to figure this out on your own." But Andrew was a survivor. He had always been, and he would continue to be. No matter how much it hurt, he refused to rely on anyone else. He wasn't about to let Mark's coldness break him. He would work harder, push through the pain, and find another way. Yet, as the weeks passed, something in Andrew began to change. The physical toll of his work began to show, and so did the emotional toll. The realization that Mark had abandoned him, just when he needed him most, didn't just sting, it shattered Andrew's sense of identity. For so long, his worth had been tied to his ability to provide for his family, to protect them, to make sure they never felt alone. But now, it seemed as though his own son had cast him aside, as if he were just another problem to be solved by someone else. Then, the phone rang again. It was Mark. Andrew could feel his heart race as he picked up the receiver. His hands trembled. Maybe this time, things would be different. "Hey, Dad." Mark's voice came through the phone, but it didn't sound the way it had years ago. It was strained, desperate. I messed up. The business isn't doing well, and I'm in a really bad spot. I need your help. Can you lend me some money?" The words hit Andrew like a slap to the face. He could feel the anger rising within him, but he kept it in check. Mark needed help now, but where had he been when Andrew had asked for the same? Andrew's mind raced with conflicting emotions, betrayal, resentment, but also something deeper, the painful truth that Mark had never understood the value of hard work or self-sufficiency. He had always been the one to rely on Andrew, but now, when the tables were turned, he expected the same old rescue. "I can't help you, Mark," Andrew said, his voice firm and steady, despite the turmoil inside him. "You need to learn the value of standing on your own 2 feet. I've worked my whole life to make sure you wouldn't have to go through what I did. But now, you have to face the consequences of your actions." Mark's voice faltered on the other end. "But Dad, No," Andrew cut him off. "I won't be your safety net anymore. I'm not going to fix your mistakes. You need to learn responsibility, and that's something you can't buy with money. There was a long silence, and then Mark hung up. Andrew stood still, the phone still pressed to his ear. The weight of his decision settled on him. He knew it was the right choice, but it didn't make it any easier. The son he had given everything to had finally forced Andrew to let go. The real conflict wasn't about money. It was about responsibility. It was about teaching Mark what it meant to stand on his own, without relying on the sacrifices of others. And for Andrew, the battle wasn't just with Mark. It was with himself, his pride, his love, and his need to teach a lesson that would change both of their lives forever. In the days following the phone call, Andrew was left alone with his thoughts, each one more painful than the last. He had expected Mark to be upset, to argue, to perhaps try and convince him that he really needed the money. But what happened instead was silence. Mark didn't call back. He didn't send a message or even acknowledge Andrew's refusal. The anger Andrew had felt in the moment slowly started to settle into something else, disappointment. Andrew sat at his kitchen table, the once bustling center of his life, now eerily quiet. The flickering light above cast long shadows across the worn wood, highlighting the dust that had settled in the corners of the room. His once proud hands, callous from years of hard work, now felt like they belonged to someone else. He stared out the window at the empty street, the absence of Mark's presence in his life becoming more and more pronounced. For the first time, Andrew felt completely alone, not just physically but emotionally. Mark was gone, not just physically but from his heart too. How had it come to this? The questions gnawed at Andrew, each one more painful than the last. Where had he gone wrong? Was it his fault? Had he pushed Mark too hard? Was this a consequence of his obsession with providing a better life for him? Andrew had spent so many years teaching Mark how to survive, how to succeed. And yet, when it mattered most, when Mark needed to stand on his own 2 feet, he hadn't done it. He had turned to Andrew, the very man who had taught him self-reliance, and asked for help, just as if nothing had changed. But the truth was undeniable. Something had changed. Andrew had always known that one day Mark would grow up and make his own way in the world. But he hadn't prepared himself for this. He hadn't prepared himself for the harsh reality that Mark didn't need him anymore. Or worse, that Mark was too proud, too comfortable with his own success, to see the value in helping the man who had given him everything. It hurt in ways Andrew couldn't put into words. The silence that followed Mark's call lingered for days, thick and suffocating. It was inescapable. The house, which once echoed with laughter and conversation, now felt like a tomb. The emotional distance between father and son had been growing for years, but this was the moment it became undeniable. The breach was no longer something they could ignore or gloss over. It was real, raw, and painful. The love that Andrew had for Mark, unconditional and unwavering, was now being tested in ways he had never imagined. It wasn't just about the money. It wasn't about the business or the help Andrew had asked for. It was about the trust they once had, the bond that had held them together through the toughest times. That bond, the one that Andrew had believed was unbreakable, was now a fraying thread, slipping through his fingers. The more Andrew thought about it, the more the pain deepened. He had given everything for Mark, his time, his energy, his dreams. He had sacrificed his own happiness, his own comfort, to make sure Mark would never want for anything. And yet, when the roles were reversed, when Andrew was the one in need, Mark had turned away. There was no apology, no explanation, no attempt to make things right. There was just the cold, hard truth. Mark had moved on, and he didn't need his father anymore. Andrew's pride, the very thing he had built his life on, was now bruised. But even more than that, it was his heart that ached. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had done everything for Mark, and yet it wasn't enough. All those years of hard work, all those sacrifices had led him to this moment of profound loneliness. He had spent so long pouring into his son's future that he had forgotten to nurture his own. And now, it seemed, his own future was slipping away, piece by piece. And as the days wore on, the feeling of betrayal lingered. There were moments when Andrew would find himself staring at the phone, willing it to ring, hoping it was Mark calling to apologize, to explain, to make things right. But those moments were fleeting, replaced by the harsh reality that Mark wasn't coming back. The truth stung more than Andrew cared to admit. He had spent his entire life trying to shield Mark from the harshness of the world. He had worked tirelessly, built a life that could offer his son everything he never had, and in the process, he had unknowingly created a chasm between them. Mark had grown up, moved on, and left Andrew behind, with nothing but the hollow echoes of a relationship that no longer existed. The next time Andrew saw Mark, it wasn't in person. It was through a brief, unexpected phone call. Mark, sounding more urgent than before, explained that his business was on the verge of collapse. The debts were mounting, the clients were backing out, and Mark was at the end of his rope. He needed money, desperately. It was the same request. Only this time, Mark didn't have the luxury of pride. He had nothing left to hold on to. His voice trembled as he spoke, the desperation clear. "Dad, I'm in trouble. I don't know who else to turn to. Please, just this once." Andrew's heart sank. He could hear the weight of the situation in Mark's voice, but it was different this time. Something had shifted in Andrew. An unshakable resolve had taken root in him. He wasn't angry anymore. He was calm, but his voice was firm. "I can't help you, Mark," he said, each word weighed down with years of sacrifices and hard-earned wisdom. "I've given you everything I have, and you've turned your back on me. You need to figure this out yourself. You need to face the consequences of your actions." Mark's silence on the other end of the phone was deafening. The words had cut deeper than Andrew had anticipated, but he knew, without a doubt, that this was the moment that would define their future. The harsh reality was this. Mark needed to learn that life wasn't about taking. It was about earning, fighting, and standing on your own 2 feet. The following days were the hardest Andrew had ever faced. The emotional weight of his decision to refuse Mark's request continued to haunt him. And yet, in the quietest moments, Andrew knew deep down that it was the right thing to do. He had spent his entire life caring for Mark, ensuring that his son had every opportunity, every advantage. But that same son, now an adult, was showing no understanding of the sacrifices Andrew had made. The pride Andrew had taken in his role as a father, the one person Mark could always depend on, was now a distant memory. Andrew had watched Mark grow from a wide-eyed boy full of potential into a man who was self-assured, sometimes arrogant, but always in control. Or so it seemed. Mark had never seen the world through the lens of struggle that Andrew had lived through. He didn't know what it was like to go without, to work for every penny, to build a life from nothing. And now, as the consequences of his choices began to close in on him, Mark was looking for a lifeline. And that lifeline, in his mind, was Andrew. But for Andrew, it was more than just a financial transaction. It wasn't about money. It was about Mark's attitude toward everything that Andrew had given him. Mark had never had to truly fight for anything, and Andrew realized that this had made him weak in spirit, weak in character. Andrew couldn't allow his son to keep leaning on him, not when he'd spent years teaching him the very opposite, to stand up, to take responsibility, and to own his mistakes. The call had ended with Mark's desperate plea lingering in the air, and for the next few days, Andrew didn't hear from him again. Part of Andrew wondered if Mark had accepted his refusal, if perhaps this time he had finally realized the depth of his father's words. But another part of Andrew, one that had been buried under years of sacrifice and fatherly love, wondered if he had just lost his son for good. But the pain wasn't about the rejection. It was about the realization that he had no control over Mark's choices. And more than that, he had no control over his son's perception of him. All those years of providing, of being the pillar Mark could rely on, seemed to have vanished into thin air. What had it all been for? Was this how Mark saw him now? As just a means to an end? An ATM for when times got tough? Andrew wasn't sure if Mark would ever truly understand the depth of his father's love and sacrifices. It wasn't about money or possessions. It was about the relationship they had built, the bond that Andrew had thought would last forever. And now, Mark's pride had severed that connection, perhaps permanently. It wasn't just the refusal that tore at Andrew. It was the silence that followed. The silence from Mark, the lack of a follow-up message, the absence of an apology. Andrew's mind kept running over their past interactions. The good times, when Mark was young, and everything seemed possible. The moments when they would spend time together, laughing, talking about the future, when Mark seemed so full of promise. Andrew had always been there to catch him when he stumbled, to offer guidance, even when it was tough. And now, that same son had turned his back on him when it mattered most. Days turned into weeks, and Andrew's pride in his independence began to feel more like a prison. He continued to work, to push himself through the pain, to keep his small business afloat. But the loneliness crept in deeper. It wasn't just the physical pain of working long hours. It was the emotional toll of having no one to share the burdens with. The house was too quiet, too still. He would sit in his chair at the end of the day, looking at the faded photographs on the wall, pictures of Mark as a child, laughing, innocent, full of life, and wonder where it had all gone wrong. Then, one evening, as Andrew sat by the fire, staring into the flames, the phone rang again. It was Mark. This time, there was no hesitation in Andrew's voice as he picked it up. He had been waiting for this moment, though he would never admit it to himself. The moment when Mark would finally come back, when the realization of his mistakes would weigh heavily on him. "Dad, I've lost everything." Mark's voice was barely a whisper, thick with shame. "My business is done. I made so many bad decisions. I'm at the end of my rope." Andrew's chest tightened. He could hear the desperation in Mark's voice, the vulnerability he had never heard before. It was a stark contrast to the confident, self-assured man he had once been. The man who had dismissed his father's help. The man who thought he had all the answers. "Mark," Andrew said, his voice steady, but there was a certain coldness to it that surprised even him. "You didn't need me then, and you don't need me now. You made your choices. Now you need to live with them." Mark was silent for a long time. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke again. "I don't know what to do, Dad. I've lost everything. I need you. Please." The words hung in the air like an accusation, an admission of guilt, a cry for redemption. Andrew felt a pang in his heart, but this time it was different. This time, he knew the lesson had to be learned. Mark couldn't continue to use Andrew as his crutch. Not anymore. "Mark," Andrew said, his voice firm but calm, "I gave you everything, but I won't fix your mistakes. You have to face this. You have to stand up and learn what it means to be responsible." There was no response. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Andrew felt the weight of the years of love, sacrifice, and regret hanging between them. But he stood firm. "I'm sorry, Mark," Andrew said finally, his voice barely a whisper now. "I can't help you anymore. You need to figure this out on your own." With that, the call ended. And for the first time in years, Andrew felt the strange sense of peace that only comes from letting go. Mark had to learn, and so did Andrew. The lesson wasn't just for Mark, it was for both of them. It was about realizing that love, respect, and responsibility could no longer be taken for granted. It was about standing on your own, no matter how difficult it was. It had been weeks since Andrew last spoke to Mark, and though life in the small house carried on with its monotonous rhythm, something had shifted inside him. The silence between father and son had grown so deafening that it began to seep into Andrew's soul. He continued his work, his routine, but everything felt different now. The emotional weight of his decision to stand firm was beginning to take its toll. Andrew had thought that by refusing Mark's request for help, he would find peace. But instead, he found emptiness. The sense of righteousness he had initially felt began to waver as he questioned whether he had made the right choice. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a memory of Mark. The old baseball glove sitting on the shelf, the photograph from Mark's high school graduation hanging crooked on the wall, each one a stark reminder of the bond they once shared. Andrew's heart would tighten whenever he saw them. The memories were bittersweet now, tinged with regret and loneliness. He had raised Mark to be strong, independent, and capable, but now that Mark was facing his own failures, Andrew was left to wonder if he had done too much for him too soon. There were nights when Andrew would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through the years they had spent together. He had given everything for Mark, sacrificing his own happiness, his own dreams, to ensure that his son would never want for anything. But in doing so, Had he created a man who was too dependent on others to ever truly understand the weight of responsibility? Had he failed Mark in the very ways he thought he was protecting him from? It was a question that gnawed at him, a question he couldn't escape. Then, one evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, the phone rang again. This time, it was a different kind of call. There was no urgency, no desperation in Mark's voice. It was quiet, measured, almost calm. It caught Andrew off guard. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot." Mark's voice was tentative but not as desperate as before. "I know I messed up. I know I've been a terrible son, and I've taken you for granted. I've been so caught up in my own life that I didn't realize how much I've hurt you." The words hit Andrew like a shock to his system. He had expected anger, more excuses, or even silence. But this was different. Mark was apologizing. And for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no defensiveness, no pride, just raw vulnerability. It was as if a weight had been lifted from both of them. And in that moment, Andrew felt the heaviness in his chest start to dissipate. "I'm sorry, Dad," Mark continued, his voice breaking slightly. "I never understood what you went through for me. I thought I had everything figured out, that I didn't need anyone. But I see now how wrong I was. I wasn't there when you needed me, and I'm sorry for that." Andrew's heart ached at the sincerity in his son's words. He had waited so long for this moment, but it wasn't the apology he had expected. It wasn't the apology he had been holding out for. It wasn't just about Mark acknowledging his mistakes. It was about something deeper. Mark had finally understood what it meant to take responsibility for his own life. Andrew felt a lump form in his throat as he realized something important. This was the moment he had been waiting for, but it wasn't just a revelation for Mark. It was a revelation for him, too. He had spent so much time focused on the pain, the betrayal, that he had missed the most important truth. The lesson he had been trying to teach Mark wasn't just about responsibility. It was about forgiveness, about letting go, and about understanding that growth could only come from struggle. "Mark," Andrew said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, "I didn't want to help you because I knew you needed to learn this lesson on your own. I didn't want to be your crutch anymore. But I realize now that I was holding on to something, too. I've been holding on to the past, to the way I thought things should be. And I have to let that go." "We both do." There was silence on the other end of the line, and then Mark spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I don't expect you to fix everything, Dad," Mark said, "but I want to try to make things right. I want to rebuild what we had, if you'll let me." The words hit Andrew like a wave. In that moment, the world seemed to shift. The weight of the past, the burden of anger and disappointment began to lift. Mark had finally taken responsibility, not just for his actions, but for his relationship with his father. And Andrew, in turn, was learning to let go of the anger and disappointment that had held him captive for so long. "I've always wanted the best for you, Mark," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need you to understand something. Life isn't about always getting what you want. It's about earning it. It's about learning from the hard times and being better because of them. I can't fix everything for you, but I'll be here for you when you're ready to stand on your own." Mark's voice, though quiet, was filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad. I won't let you down again. I promise." As Andrew hung up the phone, a sense of calm washed over him. He had held onto the belief that Mark needed him to fix everything, to be the hero, to be the man who always saved the day. But the truth was that Mark didn't need that anymore. He needed the space to grow, to make his own decisions, and to face his own consequences. Andrew realized that, in his attempt to protect Mark, he had never allowed him the chance to truly stand on his own. And now, with Mark finally accepting responsibility for his actions, Andrew could do the same. He had spent years trying to hold things together, trying to control the narrative, but the real lesson wasn't in fixing problems. It was in letting go. The weeks after the phone call were quieter, but they were filled with a different kind of tension. Andrew felt the shift in their relationship, felt Mark's determination to make things right, but the emotional scars that had been left behind weren't so easily healed. There is a part of Andrew that still questioned whether Mark's newfound understanding of responsibility was genuine or just a temporary response to his own failures. Could his son really change? Or was this just another momentary lapse of clarity before he slipped back into his old ways? But as days passed, Andrew saw a different side of Mark. He was reaching out more, not just with words but with actions. Mark began showing up at Andrew's house, not with an agenda or a request, but just to spend time. They had coffee together, they talked about the past, about what had gone wrong, and about what needed to change. For the first time in a long time, there were no expectations, no hidden motives. It was just two people, father and son, sitting together, acknowledging the pain and the mistakes, but also slowly beginning to rebuild what had been broken. One afternoon, as they sat on the old porch that Andrew had built himself, Mark spoke up, his voice quieter than usual. "Dad," he began, "I know I can't make up for all the years I took you for granted, but I want to try. I'm starting over. No more running away from responsibility. I've learned what it means to struggle, and I'm ready to face it. I need to be the man you always wanted me to be." Andrew looked at his son, and for the first time in a long while, he saw the sincerity in Mark's eyes. It was a look Andrew hadn't seen since Mark was a child, wide-eyed and full of hope. But this time it wasn't innocence. It was a reflection of the growth that had come from pain, from failure, and from facing the truth. Mark had changed, and it was in this quiet, simple moment that Andrew realized that his son wasn't the same man who had walked away from him in his time of need. There was something raw in Mark now, something real. He wasn't just asking for forgiveness. He was offering it to himself. And in that moment, Andrew saw not only Mark's growth, but his own. As the conversation continued, Andrew felt the weight of his own decisions start to lift. The anger, the betrayal, the regret, all of it was slowly dissipating. He had held on to those emotions, told himself that he needed to stay firm, that he couldn't allow Mark to walk all over him again. But now, in this moment of clarity, Andrew understood that he, too, had been holding on to something that was preventing him from moving forward. His need to be right, his desire to have the final say, his pride. Just as Mark had to learn to face his own demons, Andrew had to learn to let go of his own. "You don't have to prove anything to me, Mark," Andrew said, his voice softer now, more vulnerable than it had been in years. "I'm proud of the man you're becoming. But more than anything, I want you to know that I'm here for you. Not because I have to be, but because I want to be. This isn't about me fixing things anymore. It's about both of us learning to live with what's happened and moving forward." Mark's eyes glistened as he nodded, and for the first time, he seemed to understand something that had been missing from their relationship all along. It wasn't about what Andrew had done for him. It was about what they could both do for each other in this moment together. The air around them was still, the only sound the soft rustle of the trees in the breeze. Andrew realized, as they sat there in silence, that the emotional chasm between them wasn't as wide as it had once seemed. They weren't perfect, and their relationship would never be without its flaws, but they had both come a long way. In a way, they had been on parallel journeys. Each had suffered, each had struggled, but now they were walking in the same direction side by side. Just then, Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn envelope. Andrew raised an eyebrow, curious. Mark handed it over, his face tinged with a mixture of nervousness and hope. It was an old letter, one that Andrew recognized instantly. The letter from the business he had once helped Mark apply to when he was just starting out. The letter had been tucked away in a drawer, one of the many things that had been forgotten as Mark moved forward with his life. But now, as he handed it over to Andrew, it felt symbolic. It wasn't just a letter about a job or an opportunity. It was Mark's attempt to make things right in the simplest, most direct way he knew how. "I don't know if this is enough," Mark said quietly, "but I want to start over, really start over. With you. I know I've messed up, but I'm trying. I'm really trying." Andrew took the letter, and for a moment he simply looked at it. His fingers traced the edges, feeling the worn paper. It was small, but it was significant. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a promise. A promise that things would get better, even if it took time. "I know you are, Mark," Andrew said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know, and that's enough." The air between them was charged with a quiet understanding now, a connection that neither of them had expected to find again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Mark and Andrew sat in silence, the weight of years of tension gradually lifting. Mark had given Andrew the letter, a symbol of his renewed commitment to change, but more than that, it was an invitation to trust again. Andrew held it in his hands, but it wasn't the letter itself that held power. It was the moment they shared as father and son. This wasn't just about a piece of paper or a job offer. This was about something far deeper. It was about reconciliation, about accepting the past, and about stepping into the future without the burden of regret. For the first time in years, Andrew felt a sense of peace he hadn't even realized he was missing. The years of hard work, sacrifice, and emotional isolation had left their marks on him. But now, as he looked at Mark, he saw a man who had learned, who had grown. It wasn't perfect. They both had a long road ahead of them. But in that moment, Andrew knew that this was the turning point, the moment when their relationship began to heal. Mark spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost unsure, but the sincerity was undeniable. I don't expect things to go back to the way they were. I know I've hurt you, but I promise, Dad, I'm going to do better. I'll show you, not just with words, but with actions. Andrew's heart softened as he heard those words. He had spent so many years wanting Mark to say this, to finally acknowledge the weight of his actions. And now that it was happening, it felt like a heavy burden was slowly being lifted from his chest. Mark wasn't just apologizing. He was taking responsibility for the choices he had made, for the way he had distanced himself from the man who had always been there for him. I know you are, Andrew replied quietly. And that's all I've ever wanted, just for you to understand. Life's hard. We both know that. But it's in the hard moments that you find out what you're really made of. And it's in the struggle that you learn who's really worth holding on to. Mark looked down for a moment, as if processing his father's words. Then, without looking up, he spoke again. I've been trying to fix things with my business, but it's been rough. I've made mistakes, and I need help. But I want to earn it. Not just take from you anymore, but to do things on my own. I don't want to be the person I was before. Andrew heard the raw emotion in Mark's voice, the self-awareness that had been so missing in their past conversations. He realized that Mark wasn't asking for forgiveness in the way he had expected before. He wasn't asking for Andrew to save him. He was asking for understanding, for guidance, not as a crutch, but as a father who had always believed in him. You've already taken the first step, Mark, Andrew said gently, his voice filled with emotion. You're doing it. You're taking responsibility, and that's all I ever needed from you. I can't fix everything for you. You know that. But I'll be here when you need me, and I'll help however I can. Mark nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude and a quiet understanding that hadn't been there before. For a long time, he had assumed that his father's love was unconditional, something that would always be there no matter how much he took it for granted. But now he saw that love wasn't just about giving. It was about respect, growth, and the willingness to learn from mistakes. I'll never be able to repay you for everything you've done for me, Mark said, his voice breaking slightly. But I want to try. I want to be a better man. I'm starting right now. Andrew smiled, a small but genuine expression. I don't need repayment, Mark. What I need is to see you stand on your own. I need to see you become the man I know you can be. There was a long pause, and then, as if by some unspoken agreement, they both stood and walked to the porch. The sky had turned a deep shade of indigo, and the stars began to appear one by one, as though the night itself was taking a breath in their shared silence. The world outside their small house seemed vast and filled with possibilities, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel so lonely. Mark's steps were more assured now, and Andrew could feel a shift in him, a shift that had been years in the making. He wasn't the same young man who had once walked away, dismissing the very love that had shaped him. Now he was something new, a man who had been tested and had come out stronger, not because of some victory or success, but because of the humility he had learned. Thank you, Dad, Mark said quietly, his voice full of emotion, for not giving up on me. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm going to prove to you that I can be the man you always wanted me to be. Andrew looked at his son, feeling a profound sense of pride well up in his chest. It wasn't just that Mark had finally acknowledged his mistakes. It was that he had made the conscious decision to be better, to make amends, and to take responsibility. This was the moment, the climax, that had taken them from years of pain and resentment to a place of understanding and, perhaps, eventual healing. "It's all I've ever wanted, Mark," Andrew replied softly, his eyes warm with the love he had always held for his son. "For you to understand that you have to earn it, just like I did." They stood there together, father and son, under the vast, starry sky, and for the first time, the weight of the past didn't feel so heavy. The journey they had both taken, through pain, betrayal, and growth, had led them to this moment. And it was enough. The days that followed the conversation on the porch felt different. Andrew could no longer deny that something significant had changed. The tension that had once filled the space between him and Mark seemed to have lifted, replaced by a fragile but real sense of understanding. Their relationship wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was no longer defined by the walls of hurt and disappointment that had kept them apart for so long. Andrew found himself watching Mark more closely, noticing the small but important changes in him. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic moments. Instead, it was the quiet, subtle shifts in Mark's behavior that gave Andrew hope. Mark showed up more often, not just when he needed something, but to be present, to share a meal, to sit in silence with his father and watch the world outside their window change with the seasons. These were the moments that spoke volumes, the moments that told Andrew that Mark was trying, really trying, to be a better son, and more importantly, a better man. Andrew, too, found himself changing. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the constant pressure to fix things. He had spent so much of his life trying to be everything to everyone, particularly to Mark, that he had forgotten to live for himself. He had sacrificed his own happiness, his own dreams, to make sure Mark never wanted for anything. But now, as he watched Mark slowly rebuild his life, Andrew realized that he, too, had the right to step into his own future. The years of resentment and anger, of feeling unappreciated and alone, slowly began to fade. One evening, as they sat together again on the porch, Mark turned to his father with a new sense of resolve in his eyes. "Dad," he said quietly, "I know I've asked a lot of you, and I can't change the past, but I want you to know that I'm doing this on my own now. I'm building my business, not because I need a handout, but because I've learned what it means to work for what I have. I'm ready to stand on my own 2 feet. You taught me that." Andrew looked at his son, the same young man who had once walked away, and felt a deep sense of pride swell in his chest. This wasn't about success or money. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. This was about Mark finally understanding the lesson that had taken so many years to sink in: responsibility, respect, and the power of self-sufficiency. "I've watched you grow, Mark," Andrew replied softly, his voice steady, "and I'm proud of the man you're becoming. You don't need to prove anything to me anymore. What matters is that you're finally standing up for yourself, and you're doing it the right way." Mark nodded, his eyes sincere. "Thanks, Dad. I never would have gotten here without you. I know that now." For Andrew, this was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when Mark, no longer the boy who needed to be saved, stood before him as an equal. This wasn't a victory for Andrew or Mark. It was a mutual understanding, a respect that had been earned through years of struggle, pain, and ultimately, forgiveness. Both of them had changed, but neither of them could have done it alone. As they sat there in the quiet of the evening, Andrew felt a wave of peace wash over him. The pain of the past was still there, lingering in the background, but it no longer controlled him. He had spent so many years holding onto the hurt, convinced that it was a part of who he was. But now, he understood that letting go of that pain didn't mean he was weak. It meant he was ready to embrace the future. Mark had learned the value of hard work, the importance of earning his way in the world, and the consequences of taking others for granted. Andrew had learned the value of forgiveness, of stepping back and letting go, and the realization that love was not just about giving, but about allowing others to grow on their own. "Dad," Mark said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking. I want to go back to school. I want to finish what I started. I think it's time to do things right." Andrew smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You're ready," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "And you'll do it, Mark. I have no doubt." The sound of crickets chirping in the distance filled the silence between them. There was no more tension, no more uncertainty. Just two people, father and son, who had faced their mistakes and come out on the other side stronger. As the night deepened and the stars appeared overhead, Andrew sat back, feeling a sense of contentment he hadn't known in years. He didn't need to control everything anymore. He didn't need to fix every problem. What mattered now was that Mark had taken responsibility for his life, and that Andrew had learned to let go of the past. It wasn't about perfection. It was about growth, forgiveness, and the understanding that no matter how broken something might seem, it could always be rebuilt. This was the message Andrew wanted Mark to carry with him, and it was the message that he, too, had embraced. Growth comes from struggle, and redemption comes from understanding. They had both come a long way, and now, as they sat together on the porch, the future seemed brighter than it ever had before. This story is a reminder that the journey of healing, both for ourselves and in our relationships, is never easy, but it's always worth it. Whether you've experienced betrayal, disappointment, or the slow unraveling of a bond you once thought was unbreakable, it's important to remember that growth and change are possible for both you and the people you love. If you've ever found yourself in a similar situation, struggling with forgiveness, or trying to rebuild a broken relationship, take a moment to reflect. What lessons can you take from this story to apply to your own life? Are there relationships that need mending or past hurts that need to be let go of? Sometimes, the hardest part isn't the first step. It's letting go of the anger and accepting the possibility of change. Mark's journey wasn't just about asking for forgiveness. It was about accepting responsibility, making amends, and learning the value of hard work. Andrew's journey was about letting go of the past, forgiving not only his son but himself, and realizing that love doesn't always mean fixing everything. It means supporting and guiding, even when it's difficult. If you found inspiration in this story, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear it, or take a moment to think about how you can begin to rebuild relationships in your life. And if you're ready to take the next step in your own personal growth or healing journey, I encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more stories and insights that will challenge and inspire you. Let's continue this journey together, because when we grow best by supporting one another.